Welcome back to another video lecture here at UCLA Extension for AP teachers. Today what we're going to go over is the historical thinking skills. Well, I got a little bit of a story behind this. So you might all remember, some of you might not, that we used to have a set of skills a few years ago, and there's kind of that bad S word that we're not allowed to say anymore with an AP. You know the word. It's called synthesis. So synthesis used to be a part of our old historical thinking skills. And the idea of historical thinking skills back then was that we would make connections between different time periods. We're not allowed to say that word anymore. Don't try doing that in polite company amongst AP teachers. Those historical thinking skills are gone. Now we've come up with a whole new set of historical thinking skills. And I've got to say, these ones I think are really concise, and they really give us a lot of different ways of thinking about history. A little bit of a story though before we head into there. So where does AP even come from? Like, when did we have this first? Well, I did a little bit of research into this and found out that advanced placement classes actually started all the way back in the late 1940s. Why back then? Well, the reason why was we were in the Cold War, and the idea was that we would get the best students in math and science so we could beat the communists in the Cold War. Yeah, believe it or not, AP was a product of the Cold War. So AP started, advanced placement, as really for the elite students in the country. Well, the communists are gone, the Cold War is done. So because of that, what do we move to in AP? We moved to open enrollment or open access. We want as many students taking these classes as possible. Why would we do something like that? Well, I'm going to give you two reasons. One, when you do the research, it turns out students who take AP classes are far more likely to get into college, and they're far more likely to succeed in college. And you kind of know why. We're teaching them all the skills that they need. Sure, they're not always great at it, but we're laying down the seeds for them to do really well in the future. And think about all the skills you teach them on a daily basis. Yeah, we're teaching them historical content. We're teaching them historical skills. We're also teaching them prioritizing, time management, how to read and write at a critical level, how to advocate for yourself inside the classroom, and how to raise your own self-expectations. In the end, we're teaching them how to be really strong, hard-working, hard-thinking adults. And that takes root for them. Here's the second reason, though, why I like to teach AP to a vast majority of students. It's because AP sets up a framework for the students to think at a deeper level. We're asking big questions of students about history. And that's going to get us into these historical thinking skills. Because in the end, really what we're doing in these advanced placement classes is we're moving away from memorization and comprehension into deep interpretation. And that takes us to the thinking skills. Okay. Let's start off with the boring part. The boring part is where you're going to find these historical thinking skills. So you're going to find them in the course and exam description. If you're in AP World History, you want to go to pages 14 to 15. If you're in AP US History, you want to go to pages 16 to 17. Okay, we're done with the boring stuff. Let's get into the actual work. So here's the great thing about the historical thinking skills. As you probably have noticed in looking at them at the pages, they're pretty complicated, but we can kind of narrow them down. All of them have basically three levels to them. Level 1 is identify, level 2 is explain, and level 3 is significance. And that's pretty much true of all of these different skills. Okay, let's go to skill number 1. Skill number 1 is about historical concepts or processes. We want to identify, explain, and give the significance. Okay, what do I mean by historical process? I mean something that happens over time, like a pattern that leads up to an event. In AP World History, a good example of that would be World War I. We know in our classes, most of the time we try to dispel that myth from students that the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand, that was the real cause of World War I. That was the final thing that threw us into it. We know there was a process of industrialization, imperialism, and nationalism that led up to that assassination that led to World War I. Skill number 2 is all about how we use sources and place them into a good analysis and situation. We want to identify a source, we want to talk about what perspective that source is coming from, who the audience is, and really what the purpose was. Now, probably the biggest thing we want to do out of all of this is make a difference for students. We want to show them there's a difference between what the source says and what its purpose is. Most students get caught up on just comprehension, which in and of itself is a huge skill to have. But we try to teach students that what a person was saying also has an agenda behind it, and we want to figure out what that agenda was all about. Skill number 3 is about evidence. Evidence is a lot more complicated than we might think for students. Why? Because there are different types of evidence. There's primary source evidence and secondary source evidence. We also know that there can be textual evidence versus graphic evidence. And in the end, we want students to be able to compare pieces of evidence, to be able to show how evidence can support or maybe modify or even refute an argument that is being made. This is going to be really important, by the way, for establishing our overall claim, our thesis, and also our counter-thesis, in which students are going to show that they can understand nuanced or different arguments that are brought up in history. Skill number 4 is contextualization. I always thought this would be the easiest for the students. Turns out it's pretty hard. So how do we explain contextualization? Contextualization is where we establish for the students a broad framework that helps to understand where their argument is going. My explanation I always give to the students is this. Imagine it's 1976 and you're going to a movie. You sit down in the theater and the very beginning of the movie has a huge opening, big music. And then there's this crawl that comes down that talks about how in a galaxy a long, long time ago, far, far away, there was a battle between this group called the Empire and a group called the Rebels. Yet, I'm talking about my favorite group of movies, Star Wars. And we all know what it's about today. But in 1976, the audiences had no clue. But when they walked in, they got that crawl, and now they could enter into the story. That's the same thing I want students to do for their essay arguments when they set it up. They're going to give me, the reader, a sense of where this is going by setting the context, the broad themes of the time period right before and right during. Skill number 5 is all about making connections. In other words, identifying patterns within history. We want students to be able to demonstrate that one part of history is connected to the next, that there's patterns between the two that lock them together. My favorite is industrialization versus imperialism. Most students, if you teach them this, kind of see industrialization over here, imperialism over here. But we all kind of know that they're really related. How so? Industrialization required raw resources. Imperialism was when they went out to get those. My favorite story on this one has to do with, you got it, bat feces. What? What I'm talking about here is in Argentina. The British found bat dung that would be dried within caves had nitrogen in it and could be used for dynamite so that they could blow up things in order to make railroads. In other words, industrialization, the need for raw resources, imperialism, let's go on out to Argentina and get ourselves some good old-fashioned bat dung. Skill number 6, argumentation. This is the queen of all the skills. This is what we're leading up to. Everything we've done before leads up to the ability for students to make their own original arguments. In this particular skill, we're having the students build up their ability to make a claim, to make a counterclaim in which they can modify or refute that. They can also demonstrate the different types of evidence that they can use to back that up, primary, secondary sources. They can use it in a way in which they corroborate, modify, or refute the arguments that are being made. They establish a pattern of reasoning. This is basically the queen of everything we've been trying to do with our students, and it really leads up to their ability to do things like the DBQ and the long essay. So let's go back now to the very beginning, to when we talked about the different processes and developments in history. What are those? That's still kind of broad and vague to me. Well, there are 3 big ones for us to think about: comparison, causation, and change in continuity. Comparison is all about establishing patterns over time of commonality and differences, and then explaining those connections and stating why they're significant. In AP World History, for example, we know that all societies had hierarchies and kinship relationships. There is your overall comparison. But we also know that there were differences in the details. So Hinduism established a hierarchy based on the caste system. China had Confucianism and filial obligations. Those details were different. The patterns of hierarchy and kinship, those were the same. What about in AP US history? In AP US history, we had racial hierarchies and racial inequalities in the North, the South, throughout the country. However, there is still a difference between Southern slavery and Northern racism in urban cities. Next up is causation. Students need to be able to identify the patterns of cause and effect. They need to be able to demonstrate long-term versus short-term cause and effects. The way I like to explain this is what is proximate or more direct versus what is long-term. For example, let's take Russian communism. We all know that the proximate cause for Russian communism was World War I and the crisis that took place. But the long-term reason why that took place was due to Russian feudalism and the inability to get rid of serfdom. By the time we hit World War I, that was just the spark that kind of let out the flame. How about in AP US history? Let's take the American Revolution. The short-term cause was taxation without representation. But the long-term cause was about British colonists coming to America, establishing assemblies, and then establishing that identity of being independent and making local decisions. When the king took that away in taxation and representation, that lit the flame for revolution. And then last off, continuity and change. Continuity and change is all about continuous patterns and what's changed. Now, this one I always thought would be intuitive to the kids, but they have a really hard time with it. So this is the way I like to explain it to them. I always say, are you the same person now at the age of 15 or 16 as you were when you were like 7 or 8? And they go, of course not. We're taller, our voice is deeper, our muscles are bigger. We're going through a lot of things we didn't go through back then. And I say, that's right. Those are all the changes you're going through. But a question, did you have the same eye color? The same hair color? The same family? Did you have a similar personality? All of a sudden they go, that's interesting. There are patterns of continuity while there are still changes. For us in world history, for AP world history, think about how throughout most of history there was the development of those huge empires, land-based empires. But there were still changes that took place, like the gunpowder empires. We have the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. They fought each other over different interpretations of Islam. Big land-based empires, there's your continuity. Changes, fights over the differences in Islam. Or take AP US history. Throughout an entire history, we've been arguing about freedom and liberty. Our belief in freedom and liberty has not changed, but our definition has. At the beginning of our country, freedom and liberty tended to be about religious liberty, religious freedom. Then it became about local representation freedoms. Then it became about racial freedoms. Then it became about labor freedoms, and kept going from there. Okay, so that's everything as far as the historical thinking skills go. When I think of the historical thinking skills for the AP classes now, I think of them sort of like as an analogy of the foundation to a house. We all love teaching our history classes because we love teaching history. We love the stories, we love the facts, we like all the processes that we've learned about and that we want to teach to the students. The idea here, though, is to think of the foundation. How are they supposed to put all this together? And the way they do it is by teaching them the critical thinking skills that we believe are the things historians use to prioritize and organize information. As you can tell, there are a lot of these historical thinking skills, but in the end, it kind of all boils down to 3 big issues. Identifying what happened, explaining the processes, and then stating why they are significant. Now, you might have your own opinion on this, and you're definitely welcome to that as far as the way history is taught. But I think what is so important about this process and what we're doing now is that we're teaching the kids to do critical thinking and to see history not as really memorization and comprehension of facts, but rather how you make arguments and interpret and analyze and put these facts together. Thanks so much. I'll see you in class.